I was just happened to be listening to Chris Matthews, and he was maybe on a good night last night. Mm-hmm. And he made a point at the very end of his show to his talking bobbleheads there when he gets the last word in that really was very salient. And I've heard you riff on this a little bit, and I was wondering if you could give us maybe a little bit of feedback. He was asking his panel, when are we going to get done with the wrecking crew mentality? Mm-hmm. We've had 2 generations now going through school, getting their MBAs and all their business degrees in mergers and acquisitions and derivatives and hedge funds, and all of these things that are about breaking America apart and selling it off.
Right,
and
all these miniature Gordon Geckos.
Yes, and at what point are we, and Chris asked this, and this is a very salient question, at what point is this going to end?
It will end when we roll back the Reagan tax cuts. This is the really simple piece of it, Stan, and that is that when you look at the history of the United States, and Larry Beinhard did a great analysis of this. We've had him on the program a couple of times, but others have done the analysis as well. Dean Baker over at CEPR.org and others, that when the top marginal tax rate on income over anywhere between $1 and $3 million a year. In other words, you can earn up to $3 million a year and only pay 20, 30, 40% income tax. But when it gets over $3 million a year, when that top tax rate goes over 50%, then what you have is a country where the average CEO salary is only about 30 times that of the average worker, which is the way it was in the United States from the 1930s until the 1980s, and the way it is in most European countries right now, the way it is in Japan right now. You have a country where there's virtually nobody gambling in the stock market because they don't have all this spare money, hundreds of billions of millions of dollars to gamble with, and you have managers of corporations and CEOs making decisions for the long term of the corporation rather than the short term of the stock price, the dividend price, so that they can make off with more money. We have right now people in the United States who are literally earning $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion a year and paying a maximum 15% income tax because they earn that as capital gains. This is hedge fund managers, the 25 guys who met with Mitch McConnell the day before yesterday. And they want to keep it that way. And if you roll back the Reagan tax cuts, they would be taxed after the first $3 million in inflation-adjusted dollars at 74%. Well, at that point, they say, hey, I'm not going to take the money. I'm going to build the business. And whenever our top marginal tax rate, not the tax on average working people, but the tax on millionaires and billionaires, whenever that goes above 50%, the economy settles down and rationality prevails. And whenever you cut that top tax rate, as we did in the United States during Reagan and as the UK did in the late 70s and early 80s under Thatcher, you get casino economies that are dominated by finance because that's the quickest, fastest way to make a buck. And that's why the London and New York are the world centers for both casino finance and casino fraud. And the cure in both cases is to roll back the Reagan tax cuts and the Thatcher tax cuts. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Tom. And also tariffs and bringing our manufacturing.
Yeah,
will that do that?
Yeah, well, that's the structural stuff. The structural stuff is, if you want to bring our jobs back home, then let's go back to the trade policy that Alexander Hamilton proposed in 1791 with his report on manufacturers to Congress, and that was adopted in a series of legislative pieces in 1793 and stood until Ronald Reagan began taking it apart, and then Bill Clinton really tore it apart, and it's just gone now. When Reagan came into office, average import tariffs, then there was a tax on goods that hit the border to the United States. The average was around 20%, 22%. The average import tariff now is 2% or 2.1%. And because we're not using strategic tariffs, we used to say, okay, we're not going to tax imported carved sandalwood because we don't have a domestic sandalwood industry, although Thailand does. So if they want to export that to the United States, the tariff is 1%. But we are going to tax rolled steel, at 70% because we want to make sure that we have a strong domestic steel industry. We're going to tax the manufacture of clothing at 60% or 40% because we want to make sure that we're still making socks and shoes and clothes because someday those industries may need to make uniforms even. I mean, it's so ironic. I remember when the story came out a while back, this was, 5-6 months ago, and it really demonstrates this, Stan, that the border guard, our ICE guys or whatever they are, the immigration, the border guard down on the Mexican border are wearing uniforms that are made in Mexico. It's like, what? Like my head's going to explode. So, yes, Stan, we need to go back to, and thank you for opening this can of worms for me. We need to go back to rational trade policies, which is rolling back Reaganomics. And we need to go back to rational tax policies. When Ronald Reagan came into office, our national debt was about $1 trillion. No, it was about $1 trillion, which in inflation-adjusted dollars was pretty much where it had been ever since the Revolutionary War. You look at a 250-year graph of the debt of the United States, and it bumps up, during the Revolutionary War, it bumps up during the Civil War, it bumps up during the Spanish-American War, bumps up during World War I and World War II, and always goes back down to that same level, and it bumped up a little bit during Vietnam. And then you hit Reagan, and it explodes. I mean, it's like the Al Gore's thing. You need a forklift to take it off. It goes right off the chart. Because the Republicans, the strategy that Reagan came into office with was that they could destroy the social programs that they hated, that they thought were socialism, like Social Security and Medicare, that they could destroy those programs by making the government bankrupt. And the fastest way to bankrupt the government and put a lot of money in the pockets of the people who paid for their campaigns, the millionaires and billionaires, the fastest way to do that was to cut taxes on the very rich. And they did. And guess what happened? Reagan ran up more debt in his 8 years. In real dollars, he ran up more debt in his 8 years than every president from George Washington to Jimmy Carter, that is from George Washington to Ronald Reagan, every president combined. And now that $3 trillion debt that Reagan left us with went up to $5 trillion under Bush, and Bush took it to $12 trillion. Again, doing the exact same strategy, the star of the beast. It's destroying our country.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.